Georgia. I'm in the computer lab. This is my first time really doing a PowerPoint presentation, and certainly my first time conducting an online lecture. I'm going to move from slide this. Oh, I got you. Okay. I'm going to kind of move through this fairly quickly because when I recorded it, it didn't record properly, but it was 2 hours. And we now have approximately 45 minutes. So I really need to kind of condense things. But hopefully it will be, recorded and available and archived, and you can go and listen to it at a later date and certainly review the slides. So what I wanted to cover was community land trusts and other options for community ownership of land. I'm not providing legal advice. I'm really, provoking you, sharing information, sharing experiences. I certainly urge anyone who's engaged in a land transaction to employ competent local professionals. They are the ones that know all the nuances and peculiarities and formalities about land transactions, which tend to be fairly technical and need to be exactly executed in order to make sure the transaction is perfected and there are no problems in the future. I'm going to cover sort of the basics of land ownership. I'm going to talk a little bit about cooperatives. I'm going to talk a little bit about community land trusts, and hopefully we'll get to some alternative models of community ownership, and hopefully we'll get to a point where you can actually ask me questions. Moving right along. Okay. So I'm a lawyer. I'm a professor. I teach at Albany State University. I also practice law with the C.B. King Law Firm. I'm originally from Philadelphia. Went to Penn State. Went to University of Notre Dame Law School. Spent most of my legal career involved in socially responsive business practices. I'd say probably find the most out about me and professionally is check out Equal Exchange Inc. It's a fair trade, alternative, organic food service company based in Massachusetts. I was one of the founders of that company. I represented the founders as their attorney and was instrumental in the organizational design and capitalization of the company. It's a for-profit business that also supports revolutionary change throughout the world. Last year we did over $60 million in business. It is possible to do business and do good, and do radical good. But for the last 14 years I've been in Africa. I was primarily involved, I taught at Kampala International University, Open University of Tanzania. Also did a consulting tour with the African Development Bank and practiced law with Makono and Company. Tanzania was a very rich experience for me. I'm glad I'm back in the United States. I have family, I have friends. I missed my Philadelphia Hoagies, et cetera, et cetera. But I really also miss Tanzania. I came back to work with a group called New Communities, Inc., which was the first community land trust in the United States, started in Albany, Georgia, 1969. I'll get into that in a little more detail. So it was a very, rich opportunity to come back to the United States and be part of the New Communities effort. So that's me. You can find out more about me as you need to. So what is property? And property was sort of divided into three types. One is land, we call real estate, real property. That's primarily what we're going to talk about today. And anything that's permanently attached to the land that's tangible is considered real property. Personal property is considered tangible objects that are not permanently attached to the land. And of course, we thirdly have intellectual property, which we consider creations of the mind to be simple and general. And they're manifested by our copyrights, our patents, and our trademarks. So, for instance, this presentation could easily be copyrighted and certainly would have a trademark. It's an intellectual property. It is intellectual property. It's a creation of my mind. Ownership, which obviously connected to property, consists of what we consider a bundle of rights. Number one, possession. Actually having physical control over the property. Secondly, control, where you're actually making decisions. You're making determinations about how the property is used, who can use it, when they can use it, etc. Exclusion, keeping people or objects from the property. Disposition, destruction, sale, lease, etc. And those are the bundle of rights that are not normally associated with ownership, certainly normally associated with property. Ownership can entail all or some or any combination of these four overly generalized attributes of property. But, what's most of concern, I would think, to most of us is basically possession and control. Ownership is subject to certain governmental and, I guess, private conditions. Number one is zoning. The government can restrict how property is used, when it can be used, and who can use it in many instances. Eminent domain, the government also has the ability, the right to take your property for a public purpose and subject to compensation. And thirdly, there are what are called covenants. Ooh, come on now, guys, get in there. Okay, covenants, which the owner in the disposition or lease of the land can also establish certain conditions. As you probably know, there were covenants back in the day that prevented the sale of land to black folk or presented certain uses of the land. So covenants, it's a very powerful tool that can be used to, to manifest purpose and to ensure that land property is used in the way that the owners desire for it to be used. Point out that there is a different conception between African, Native American concepts of ownership, particularly in relationship to land, and European. Obviously, we operate within the European framework, but it is, I think, important to note that there are differences, and they're cultural, they're historical, and they're obviously legal. Two examples I pointed out. One was the sale of Manhattan, where the Dutch considered themselves purchasing the island of Manhattan for $24, where the Native Americans considered them providing a use, considered allowing them shared possession, access to the land, but certainly did not entail disposition or exclusion. And nevertheless, the Native Americans signed a deed, which they did not fully understand, and so there was this sale of the land that was really more of a conflict of culture than it was an actual meeting of the minds. Native Americans did not believe you could own land. Individuals could own land. Land was in trust to the community for use by the community. Had a similar example of that with the Zulu confrontation with the Dutch in southern Africa, where the Zulu had a fairly extensive migratory pattern. It's spelled out in the little graphic. And as they were moving south, the Dutch had moved north. And of course, the Dutch, they landed Cape Town, South Africa. They assumed they were the only ones there, that no one was at the land, not realizing that this was part of the Zulu migratory pattern. And so there was this conflict. I won't belabor that, but that's worth looking into. This chart, and you can come back to this chart, just sort of contrasts the difference between European, African, and Native American. The fundamental difference being individual ownership versus community ownership. Even today, most African countries, the state owns the land, and the land is leased to individuals, it's leased to organizations, and it's least subject to the land being productively used. So that you could have a 99-year lease on land, certainly in Tanzania, but if you didn't productively use the land, that lease could be revoked, or someone could challenge your ownership of the land. I think it's interesting to contrast why there's this difference. I speculate a lot had to do with weather, a lot had to do with land density, population density, and certainly other factors, but I think those are two primary factors. But as indicated, we operate within the European system, and that's what we need to familiarize ourselves with and learn how to function as best we possibly can. So when we look at the interests, estates, and land from a Western perspective, we're talking about three basic interests in land. One is the freehold, which is basically ownership and possession. That's generally manifested by a fee simple, which has all of the rights that I specified, that bundle of rights, all of them are manifested in the fee simple, which would be evidenced by a deed. Also, you could say a life estate where someone could own land for their lifetime or the lifetime of another person. Obviously, they wouldn't have the ability to fully dispose of the land, but they certainly could dispose of their life estate. Leasehold, most of us are familiar with leasehold, where you only have the estate for a period of time, maybe years, maybe months, you really just have possession. You don't have the ability to dispose. I guess you could sell your lease, which is, pretty much, if it's a 99-year lease, that's certainly what happens in most African countries. When you're buying a land, which is, I'm going to buy a house, they're basically buying a lease. And it might be 66 years left, it might be 77, whatever, but they're basically purchasing a leasehold. And then there are the equitable interests in land. Ooh, come on, let's go back here. Like I say, this is new. Bear with me, team. Which, are, we say reversion, so that, a person who may have sold the land or donated land may have an ability, a right to regain ownership of the land if certain conditions, certain covenants are breached. The land is being used in an improper purpose, or it's attempted to be sold. The original owner could have a reversionary interest, meaning they might have a first right of refusal, or it just may, particularly if it was a donation, revert back to them without any purchase. A remainder, so one could have a life estate and remainder to the grandchildren. Easements, you may just have the opportunity to use the land for very specialized purposes, driveway, an entranceway, etc. We've talked a little bit about covenants. And then liens, where the land is subject to payment of a debt. So the land serves as security collateral for the payment of an obligation or a debt. Group ownership, something we should also be familiar with, and we'll basically look at sort of three approaches, really just two approaches. But one is tenancy by the entirety, and then there's joint tenancy. And the significance about group ownership and the tenancy by entirety and joint tenancy is that the undivided interest in land, so if two or more people own land, their interest is not divided, otherwise it would not be joint ownership. They would own it, well, it would not be joint ownership. But the significant aspect is the right of survivorship. And with a tenancy by entirety and joint tenancy, there is the right to survivorship, meaning if one party dies, deceased, moves on, the other party inherits, takes title to that deceased party's interest in the land. And it could be divided, etc. But the ownership stays within the tenants. Generally, tenancy entirety is reserved for a married couple. So if you're a married couple, whenever you buy something, it automatically becomes a tenancy by the entirety. Otherwise, the joint tenancy needs to be explicitly stated. Because if it's not explicitly stated, it is assumed that it's a tenancy in common, which means there's not a right of survivorship. So if two unmarried individuals or two unmarried organizations or three or more, etc., purchase land, it's assumed that upon their demise, their death, that their ownership interests will pass through their estate to whoever their heirs are, as opposed to the other party. And it's just something to keep in mind when we talk about collective community ownership of land. Okay, moving on, just cooperative principles. And I thought I'd bring this up because so often, collective ownership, community land trusts, and cooperatives are spoken in the same sentence, in the same breath, but not with the technical understanding and technical meaning that they actually have. And I think it's okay to do that, but I think you should also know that these terms have very technical meanings, and at some point one should distinguish or clarify that they're speaking of cooperation in the general sense as opposed to cooperation in the technical legal sense. So any organization, any association can be a cooperative if it adopts certain principles. I specify 8 principles. Generally, you talk about 7 principles, but any 3 or 4 of these principles makes an organization a cooperative. In particular, you must have one person, one vote. So regardless of capital contribution or any other type of contribution, each individual, each unit of the cooperative has one vote. Very much like our political democracy. Regardless of whether you have 10 kids or you own 15 buildings or you're 99 years old, whatever, you just have one vote. Patronage participation by members, this is another, I think, absolutely essential principle element of being a cooperative, certainly legally to take advantage of the tax advantages that are offered to cooperatives. You need to have at least one person, one vote as part of the organizational structure, and patronage participation. And by patronage participation, simply mean what you put in is what you get out. Your contribution as a percentage of all contributions is what you get from the cooperative. So if it's a farming cooperative and you're selling coffee, say equal exchange, and the farmers each contribute 10% of the total yield, each farmer then gets 10% return on the net proceeds from the sale of the coffee. If it were, some farmer did 50% and the other farmers did 10%, a farmer that got 50% would get 50% of the net proceeds. Keep in mind that farmer would also still only have one vote, notwithstanding that that farmer produced 50% of the proceeds. Education, something we should all be addressed, should be addressed in any organization, meaning that there's continuous education. Since the members of the organization are actually the managers of the organization, it's a democratically controlled organization, members should be constantly updated and educated about how properly to manage the organization. Doing business with other cooperatives, that just tends to make sense. You want to support other organizations with shared values. Open membership. Cooperatives are not supposed to discriminate based on, race, gender, etc. Certainly you could have certain qualifications as to what constitutes membership. It could be, a certain amount of land. It could be membership dues. It could be geographical location, etc. But no arbitrary, discriminatory features for joining a cooperative. Autonomy and independence, they're not, just by the nature of how a cooperative is organized, it can't be a subsidiary um, well, I guess it could be a parent company, but for the most part, we're talking about autonomy and independence. So it's individual unit, community involvement, um, you know, participating, supporting community. The individuals tend to live near or in the area in which the cooperative is located, so it makes sense for the cooperative to be very much involved in, health, education, etc. No or low interest loans to the cooperative by members. So to the extent you have capital that hasn't been withdrawn from the cooperative, you should not expect a market rate on that interest. You should expect a low interest rate. So any organization that adopts those principles is considered a cooperative. Types of cooperatives, mentioned generally the farm cooperative. We have housing cooperatives. Most people are familiar with housing cooperatives, so that you would pay your obligation in terms of the cost of your facility and ongoing maintenance would be your percentage of total square footage, or how much of the housing cooperative you actually occupy or leased. You would not own your individual unit, but you would be you'd have an undivided interest. Well, I guess you'd have a divided interest in the whole. A consumer cooperative, some of them have revolved major shopping supermarkets, but where people pull their resources by certain commodities, by certain objects, taking advantage of economy of scale, and then to the extent their residuals, those residuals would be divided up based on how much you contributed, how much you purchased. Credit cooperative, credit unions are cooperatives, so that your interest is based on the amount you contributed from, when interest is declared. Worker cooperative, these are companies that are owned by the workers, and participation is generally measured by total salaries. Your salary is a percentage of total salaries, or your hours worked as a percentage of all hours worked. But those are examples of types of cooperatives. Now moving on to a community land trust, which is considered a land owned, managed by a nonprofit corporation for the benefit of the community. The first community land trust, as I mentioned, was set up in Albany, Georgia, New Communities, Inc. And it was the first time land was put in a nonprofit corporation for the benefit of the community. And in the New Communities example, it was put in trust for farmers, and particularly farmers who had been displaced as a result of their participation in the civil rights movement in the Albany, Georgia, Southwest Georgia area. What has evolved since 1969, and there are probably over 400 or 500 land trusts in the United States now, and they're pretty much divided into two types of land trusts. I've added a third, but it's just more commentary than it is legally or technically part of a movement. But we basically have low-income affordable housing land trusts, and these are land trusts where the land, excuse my voice for being scratchy, is held by a nonprofit corporation, and housing is built by a separate corporation. So the land is leased to a housing development organization, and that housing development organization sells or leases housing units. So when those housing units are actually sold, or tenants are changed, the market value of the land is not part of the consideration. And of course, the covenants can actually declare that the property cannot be sold. The physical unit on the property cannot be sold for more than a certain percentage, 10% appreciation plus whatever may have been added to the property. We just skipped. And so, and they're pretty popular, and it's probably most land trusts, certainly in the community development arena, are low-income, affordable housing land trusts. So basically, what they do is keep housing affordable. Um, Starbucks cannot come in and say, okay, we're going to give you, $500,000 for this corner lot, because the house land can only be used for housing, and it can only be sold for a certain appreciation. Then there's land conservation, where the land trust basically says, there is no development to be taking place on this land. This land is dedicated simply for cultivation, recreation, for conservation. And then I added luxury estates because what you will have, I guess you could say, is part of the conservation movement. Someone could actually buy 600, 700, 1,000 acres of land, build a house on 30, 40 acres of the land, and then dedicate the remainder to a community development land trust for preservation and conservation. And that just assures that the 30 acres where the housing is built is not going to be disturbed by surrounding areas or by for-profit developments, because that land has now been dedicated to conservation and preservation. First community land trust, and they have 5, 10 minutes. Okay. As I mentioned, was New Communities. And it's a really interesting story, and I wish I had more time to go into it in depth. But after the Civil Rights Movement, and I say after the Civil Rights Movement, 1968, 1967, the civil rights laws were passed, and, that was considered a victory by the civil rights leaders, the folk who were promoting and leading the civil rights struggle. And so they needed to look about where were we going from there. And, they searched and they debated, and they were influenced by several factors. One in particular was Gandhi. Since most of the civil rights, many of the civil rights leaders were influenced by Gandhi in their tactics in employing civil rights, particularly nonviolence. And Gandhi, keep in mind, India had received its independence in 1947, and so Gandhi long had moved on to what he called constructive movement, constructive program, meaning how do we now continue to better humanity? How do we preserve the rights that we have gained, and how do we build upon them? We're certainly moving more towards a human rights strategy after the, and we can see now that human rights are really what's on the agenda, much more so than civil rights. So I'm trying to condense about an hour's worth of information into minutes, but so Charles Sherrard, who was leader of the Albany movement, and his colleagues, Bob Swain, who was part of the anti-war movement, but had joined Sherrard in Albany, and he was a follower of Gandhi, and so part of the influence of the Gandhi movement came not just through Martin Luther King and traditional civil rights, but also through people like Bob Swain. Slater King, who was a local realtor, Faye Bennett from the National Sharecropper Association. They looked, they pursued new strategies, and certainly they looked toward India. And as I mentioned, India had undergone the constructive program movement. And part of the constructive program movement was empowering farmers, empowering peasants. And they engaged in a land gift program. And between 1951 and 1957, they were able to secure over 1 million acres of land from wealthy landowners, large landowners, who contributed to individuals and ultimately to villages. Initially, the land that was contributed to individuals ended up back in the hands of the donors, because the villagers ended up, needing money, needing financing to manage the land, or ran into debt, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, they sold their most valuable asset, which was the land. So the land gift movement changed from giving land to individuals to giving it to villages, to putting it into a collective ownership mode.
There's a question that's popped up if you want to take it, but thought I would pause you.
Oh, okay, we can take a question.
Okay, it's coming from Nigel. Nigel, I'm going to turn the your audio on if you have it. If you don't, I'm going to type it into the box. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you well.
All right, Nigel, you're on.
Great. The question I wrote down is, how can community land trusts work together with real estate investment trusts? Can they be used together? And are there any differences or similarities between the two? And, creating cooperative economics.
Well, that's a tough question to answer. I mean, I would really need to know more about the purposes, but certainly, all organizations can work together. Just keep in mind, both, the community land trust is generally the land is dedicated to particular purposes, and it can be the land cannot be used for purposes other than what are specified in the Articles of Incorporation as the purposes for the use of the land. When you talk about a trust, land is generally held for the benefit of certain beneficiaries. It's held in trust, and the trustees manage the land for the beneficiaries. Generally, those are individuals, but certainly you could have a beneficiary that was, was conservation, or was for birds, or was for wildlife. So I'd say there's all kinds of opportunity for the two to work together. Although it would seem to me, in relationship to actually owning the land, that one would want to make a decision as to whether or not you wanted to operate pursuant to a trust or operate pursuant to a community land trust. But no reason why, if those organizations already existed, why you couldn't have a joint venture between a community land trust and a real estate investment trust.
Okay, but it has to be within the articles of Well, once it's being created, it has to be stated the purpose of the two working together.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the purposes would have to be compatible.
Okay, gotcha.
The purposes of the community land trust and the purposes of the real estate investment trust, there'd have to be some compatibility between those purposes.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? I know we've reached sort of the 10-minute marker, and there's some things I'm not going to be able to go into, but this will be posted, and hopefully you'll take the opportunity to, to listen and hopefully learn. It's really a 2-hour presentation.
There are.
I've 45 minutes. Any other questions?
Down in the chat box, there are some questions, and I will go through and look at some of the other attendees. If you have questions, go ahead and raise your hand. I will open up your microphone. There was a question of how can we use community land trust to rebuild low-income poverty communities in major cities across the U.S.? And then another question, does eminent domain apply to land trust? If you go down to the chat box, you can review them again, review the questions again, but I thought I would let you know. I've typed them in. Anybody else continue to send?
Yeah, let me just say, easy question. Eminent domain can be used against anything and anybody, so it doesn't matter whether it's a community land trust or a real estate trust. If the government decides to take the land, they have every right to take the land. We have a big issue here in Albany with new communities where, new communities own 1,600 acres of land. Most of us consider it sacred, valuable land, and they want to run a natural gas pipeline through the land. And there's nothing really new communities can do about it other than apply political pressure to prevent the pipeline folks from taking that land and running their pipeline through it. What was the other question? I'm sorry.
Oh, I had a question based off of that. I was going to say, so would it be more beneficial to have land in another country, or are you going to run into that regardless of where you are geographically? That's something that you're going to have to deal with consistently.
Yeah, the government is, the state is all powerful when it comes to land. You probably have as much power in the United States in terms of, protecting your land against government intrusion than you do in probably, certainly any other African country where, government is just, just much more powerful than it is uh, in the United States.
Okay.
And technically, for instance, in Tanzania, the government owns all of the land. Um, and that's in most African countries.
All right.
So government is leasing land, and it can just easily revoke the lease.
Correct. I was looking at something by USAID. They had a course on land trust and property rights, or land tenure and property rights, and I was going through all the different countries and what their requirements are. As we're looking for sustainable communities, you also want to make sure that you're able to protect the communities that you've developed. That's why I was very interested in learning about land trust, as well as making sure that something was covered in the summit dealing with legalities. But since we are coming up on time, I will stop talking. And there was one more question that was there that was posed down in the chat. It says, how can we use community land trust to rebuild low income poverty communities in major cities across the United States?
Yeah, that's a pretty active movement underway. I think if you, just in the short of it, if you Google community land trust, low income housing, moderate income housing, affordable housing, you'll find that there are numerous organizations, particularly in urban areas, where community land trusts have been organized to purchase land. Probably one of the most interesting is Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative in Boston. And Dudley Street was actually given the power of eminent domain. I mean, there's some arguments about that, but they were given a lot of powers, almost as if they were a municipality, and can speak a little bit about that. But again, the land, so it's taken out of the market. Um, and so what the value of the land is what's on the land, and if the covenants in the lease um, for the use of the land require that it limits the amount of participation, limits what can be built on the land. Um, you now have at least you now have a pocket of you have a neighborhood now that has housing that's always going to be, for the most part, affordable. And it's not going to be subject to you know Starbucks and shopping malls and being sold to the highest bidder. And that, I'm saying there are quite a few examples of, there are lots of examples of, of that working. When I was in Boston, we tried to create, taking this to a whole nother level of creating our own city. We wanted to incorporate the African American sections of Boston into a separate municipality that was to be called Mandela. So we were taking the community land trust concept and saying, well, let's just make a city out of a community land trust. Um, and just really sort of redefine what a municipality is in terms of what can be built, where it can be built, affordability, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, there are endless possibilities, and that really does need to be explored, and there are some great examples of how that can in fact be done. Um,
Okay. Well, I think we're coming up on time. It's 1:51. The next presenter will be logging in at 2 o'clock to prepare for the 2:10 presentation on natural childbirth and health. But oh, Mama Nobantu, did you have something to say?
No, the only thing, because I've studied community land trust before we got into working on this summit, and there's so many impoverished communities, and especially here in the Metro Atlantic area, we were trying to put together a land trust, but it was difficult to do that because you got to get the entire community involved and focus on doing it and it just required a lot of work. And in many cases, it didn't feather out, and some of them started and they didn't materialize. So the only other thing was that, you know, the corporations, the big time corporate people can't come through, even though eminent domain, as you just stated, can happen, but those big corporations, those big builders cannot come into our community land trust, and I think that's key.
Yeah, and you may want to actually explore in Atlanta. I mean, if you can, I certainly know in areas of Baltimore and some of the other northeastern cities where government, city, can actually eminent domain sections of the land and put them in a community land trust. I mean, that's just another development strategy. Where the city would actually say, okay, this area has been blighted, there's no development whatsoever going on, and we're gonna eminent domain, we're gonna purchase all the property, and we're going to now dedicate it, contribute it to a community land trust made up of perhaps some of the same residents, and put together a development strategy. And that's kind of what, you know, Gandhi's Labor Initiative looks like. But you know, city eminent domain can be used in our favor. It's not an adversarial tool against us.
Okay. There are two more questions that have come in. I'm going to try to give them to you quickly. It's 1:53, but I did want them to be answered since they sent it in. This one is coming from Shan. What was the name of your organic food company in Boston? Oh, I know the answer to that. Go ahead.
It's called Equal Exchange.
Equal Exchange.
Yeah, just Google Equal Exchange Inc.
All right, Shan, you've got that. Equal Exchange Inc. The next question came from Craig. It says, can you speak to asset forfeiture with respect to land trust?
Ooh, that's
or we can put you all in contact afterwards if it requires a little bit more communication. Craig, would you type in your email address and I will pass that forward to the presenter? Thank you. And then let's see, Nigel. Oh, I've already responded to Nigel on this. Everybody, the data that has been shared up here, I will be sure to have it up on the website this evening. I am managing a few things, so bear with me. It should be up on the website with or without audio. If I can get it up there without the audio sooner, I'll put it up there, and then you can stand by for the recording to be populated later on today. All right? Does anybody else have any questions? No? Mama Nabanta, I can hear the children in the background.
No, I don't have any more. I'm sorry. We have a little baby just came in, but we're done. We're okay.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. There will be another presentation coming on for natural healing, childbirth, and preparation. Brothers and sisters should be tuned in. This is important as we are looking to sustain our communities and focusing on what it is that we're putting inside of our systems. We give thanks to Clark Arrington for doing a very condensed and excellent job condensing his magnificent presentation. I hope that everybody is able to tune in later on when I upload the entire presentation. And if you have any further questions, please follow the steps in the schedule under the schedule tab for communicating with him at a later date. I hope this has been beneficial to you, and we're going to sign off. Have a great day. Thank you, Clark.
Thank you.
Give me the phone. Come out. I gotta use the phone.
Cool.
All right, that works for you.
Yeah, that was cool.
All right. I'm going to end the webinar now, and I will be able to save all of your the presentation. I can send it over to you too if you want it, just for your own.
Very good.
Okay.
Take care.
All right. Have a good one. Thank you.
Take care.
It's definitely a pleasure.